In this lecture, we're going to talk about comma alternatives. Now, there's about 5 of them, I think, that we're going to cover, and each of them can be replaced by a comma. So, following my primary rule of punctuation of keep it simple, you might want to ignore all this punctuation and just use commas in their place. But let's look at it for completeness, shall we? We're going to begin with the semicolon. The semicolon is a harder form of comma, so it puts in a longer pause. If you look at pauses for punctuation marks, the shortest that you got is a space, no punctuation, right? There's no pause. Then you put in a comma, that gives you a pause. A semicolon gives you a longer pause, and a period, question mark, exclamation mark, gives you the longest pause. So they're all about pauses, really, and as you're reading, it's the pauses that get across to your listeners what punctuation is being used. So let's look at the semicolon, a somewhat longer pause. Semicolon usage. Use semicolons in place of commas to insert harder pauses, typically when combining sentences. So actually the only place where I use semicolons, myself personally, is to combine sentences. So let's look at how I like to use semicolons. That's semicolons and introductions. I like to use semicolons to combine related sentences and to begin the second sentence with an introduction. Remember, the introduction is a word or a phrase, comma, and then the body of the sentence. So I'm going to use that structure with a semicolon. Now, as far as related sentences, what you want to do is use semicolons to combine two sentences that are closely related. They're almost saying the same thing. The second sentence is maybe adding some clarification. Don't just arbitrarily use it to combine any sentences. Use it if you want to create a harder link than what a period would create between two sentences. Let's look at an example, shall we? Here's the semicolon and introduction example, number 1. I like eating meals, semicolon. For example, comma, I like breakfast. So here we're combining two sentences using a semicolon and an introduction. The first sentence is, I like eating meals. The second sentence is an example, I like breakfast. So these are closely related sentences. So it makes sense to use a semicolon to combine them. And what I like to do when I do that is put a little introduction on the second sentence, which is, for example. So the whole thing becomes, I like eating meals, semicolon, for example, comma, I like breakfast, period. This is my primary use of semicolons. Now, of course, the alternative to this is to just write separate sentences, and that would look like this. I like eating meals, period. For example, comma, I like breakfast, period. So either way you could go. This separates the sentences more. Since they are kind of related, I would use the semicolon in place of a period to combine the sentences. Now, to reinforce this, let's look at a second example of semicolon and introduction usage. Brian was top of his class, semicolon. In other words, comma, he was smart, period. So you can see Brian was the top of his class and he was smart are two separate sentences that are closely related. The second sentence almost completes the first. So I combine them using a semicolon. And because I like to use a little introduction on the second sentence, I use in other words. So it becomes Brian was top of his class, semicolon, then the introduction, in other words, comma, and then the second sentence, he was smart, period. The next form of punctuation that we're going to look at is parentheses. And yes, you're right. We're going to use them primarily for parenthetical asides that are named after them. And by the way, this is what parentheses look like, these curly lines that you put around what you're parenthesizing. So the first thing I want to talk about is parentheses in nonfiction writing. I typically use parentheses in nonfiction writing, preferring commas in fiction writing. To me, parentheses just don't look correct in fiction. You can use them, but they look more like a nonfiction structure to me. So I use commas, what parentheses are an alternative to, instead of parentheses in fiction, and use parentheses in nonfiction because to me it looks better than the commas. It's a matter of taste. You can go either way, neither is wrong. Let's look. So, of course, the first use of parentheses we're going to talk about is the parenthetical aside. In nonfiction writing, use parentheses to enclose parenthetical asides. So let's look at an example of this. Here's the parenthetical aside example. The student who was new to writing, that's in parentheses, soon caught on to using punctuation period. So here, I'm using the parentheses to enclose the parenthetical aside. Now, this is a comma replacement, so I could have used commas instead. The student, comma, who was new to writing, comma, soon caught on to using punctuation. This is what I would use in fiction, and then in nonfiction, we would use parentheses to accomplish the same thing. Notice also that with parentheses, you put it after the space following students. So you're snugging it up, just like with double quotes, around the thing that it's encapsulating, which is who was new to writing. So it's a little exception to that rule of always put the punctuation after the word and before the space separating two words. Let's look at another use of parentheses, and that is to define acronyms. So you use parentheses to enclose acronym definitions. An acronym is capitalized first letters of multiple words that can be used in place of the multiple words. It's a little time saver, a little reading saver, a little space saver. So let's look at an example. International Business Machines, and then you enclose the acronym for that, which is IBM, the capitalization of each of the words, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, and you enclose the definition or the acronym in parentheses again. So this is a way to define the acronym. Now, as far as using the acronym, once you've defined an acronym, you may use it in place of the full name or phrase it defines. So define the acronym once, the first time that you would use it. So say, I work at International Business Machines, in parentheses, IBM. Then from then on, you can say, and IBM is a very good place to work. And you can just keep using IBM in place. And that's the reason you define acronyms, is to shorten the names of companies or anything else that you want to define acronyms for. Next is colons. So colons are used to introduce clarifying information, most typically in the form of a list. Here's a colon example. This report will discuss two forms of punctuation, colon, space, colons, and semicolons, period. So it's kind of like almost, it's not a sentence terminator, it's an introduction to information. So the whole sentence, this report will discuss two forms of punctuation, is the introduction to what it's going to introduce, colons and sentences. And to use that, I end the introduction with a colon, and then I specify what this is about, the clarifying information. Now, another way to form lists with colons is to introduce what I call a separate list structure. And list structures are most often either bulleted, unordered lists or numbered, ordered lists. I'm going to show you the unordered bulleted list example here, which is this report discusses the 4 common uses of commas. And then colon, and on a new line, a completely different structure, I have a bulleted list of the 4 common usages of commas. So this is the way that you use colons, you have an incomplete sentence that you end with a comma, and then you complete it with the information that the sentence is introducing. So that's using colons. The next thing that we're going to look at is using dashes. Now, I don't use dashes very often. I use commas instead. But my wife has used dashes for quite a while to introduce parenthetical asides, which is one of the options. So anyway, here's dash usage number 1. Dashes, also known as long dashes or M dashes, see, that would have been a parenthetical aside the way I just read it, can be used to replace parentheses and parenthetical asides. Speaking of parenthetical asides, let's look at an example, the dashes example. The student, dash, who was new to writing, dash, soon caught on to using punctuation. So this is just our previous parenthetical aside example using parentheses, with the parentheses replaced with a dash. And notice that the dash does not move over to snug up against what it's surrounding. It follows the traditional punctuation rules of following a word and preceding the space separating two words. Now, my wife uses this all the time. I don't like it. I would use commas instead. Here's dash usage number 1. It can be used in place of colons to introduce lists. So here's once again our list example. This report will discuss 2 forms of punctuation: dash, colons, and semicolons. Once again, I don't like this. I would use the colon instead. So I'd completely skip the dash. As we move through the punctuation here, we're getting into less and less common punctuation. I've ordered it that way. And punctuation that, frankly, I don't use. Dashes are an example of such punctuation. Finally, we're going to look at slashes. Now, slashes can be used in place of commas to produce lists. I primarily use slashes where I'm trying to get economy. I'm trying to, right, if I produce a list, it's got comma space to separate the list items, and then it's got space and space, and the last one to create the list. Instead, I can use slashes and I can save a lot of space. So if I've got something like my Udemy course title, where I can only use 60 letters for it, well, sometimes I'll take a list and I'll condense it using slashes. Let me show you this. Here's an example of creating a list. We saw this before. Dashes, long dashes, and end dashes can be used to replace parenthetical asides and or parentheses and parenthetical asides. Here I've replaced the comma space and the space and space before the last element of the list with slashes, and there are no spaces. So there's great economy as far as condensing a list. Dashes, slash long dashes, slash M dashes, they're all the same thing, so I'm creating a list, can be. So that's the way to use slashes. And with that said, we have done the comma alternatives. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about uncommon punctuation. Now, I only use one of the uncommon punctuations, and that's ellipses. The other ones, braces and brackets, I never use. So I'm only including it for completeness. I'll see you in that lecture.